welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This week, Season 2, Episode 19, Episode 73 overall. Our reading this week is the portion of Terumah, and our topic this week, volunteering. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about how much people give. And when we think about specifically how much people give, we typically think about the financial gifts that people give. How much are they donating in money? And in my work, in this time that I spend with organizations, and I talk about their donors, immediately, and I admittedly do this to some degree on purpose, immediately when I ask them about their donors, they think I'm always asking them about the people who give them money. And that's partially true. But when it's partially true, it's actually not true. The real truth is that I'm looking for anyone and everyone who donates something, who contributes anything to what it is that they do to succeed and accomplish the work that they're trying to accomplish. And so for me, in that conversation, a donor is anyone who contributes anything. And when I want them to think wider and more broadly about their world of giving, I want them to think about their world of giving in the context of not just financial gifts, but every gift. A gift of time, a gift of expertise, a gift of network, whatever it may be, and to include it in the conversation. And the reason I want to discuss that this week specifically is because the Bible over the next number of weeks, 4 of the next 5 weeks, spends an inordinate amount of time discussing the tabernacle known as the Mishkan that is being built in the desert for the people of Israel as a sanctuary, and also the vestments, the clothing, the garments that the priests would wear in the service in that tabernacle. And what's important is to not lose sight of the contribution of the people involved in that process. The details are extensive, and so we talk about all the different items that are going to need to be built and what they're going to be made out of and exactly the measurements of them and how long and how wide and how tall. All that stuff is the majority of the focus of the conversation, and because that's true, sometimes we lose sight of the actual contributions that are being made by the people for that to actually happen. And so when one looks at the Bible, both in this week's portion, in the beginning of chapter 25, and also later on in the Bible, in chapter 35, we get a variety of terms that describe the contributions of the people towards this endeavor. And so right here at the beginning of chapter 25, we get the idea, verse 2, take a portion for me, God says, from every man whose heart will motivate him. So we have the idea of a heart that motivates. Then in chapter 35, we get, in verse 21, every man whose heart inspired him, and everyone whose spirit moved him. And then it talks about the men and the women, and it talks about every person who was raised up an offering to God. All these different terms are applied to the act or the desire to act of the people as it relates to their gifts for the tabernacle. And the reality of it is, it wasn't simply just gifts that were compulsory and obligatory, because those certainly were true. The famous commentary Rashi points that out here in verse number 2, specifically that the Bible is talking about a variety, 3 different specific givings that are being done here. 2 of them are obligatory. One that goes to the sockets that were going to serve at the base of the walls, and everyone had to contribute to that, required. Another one that would go to the coffers, to the box, to the community for the sake of being used for communal offerings that needed to be purchased. Everyone had to contribute to that. But the third one is really that which was moved by the heart of the individual to give. And that's when it is that the Bible talks about the specific items that are being brought. That was of their own volition. That was their own altruism, their own need or desire or want to contribute voluntarily to this endeavor. And so we get all kinds of different gifts that the Bible talks about: obligatory versus voluntary, full-hearted versus half-hearted, maximum versus minimum. There's a variety of ways that people do give and how much they do give and how little they might give in all these different situations. And the Bible is sort of coming to discuss all of them. But it's very inspiring, very powerful, very important. The Rebbe of Slonim, in his book, the Netivot Shalom, posits that the idea here is perhaps the voluntary giving of that which is most unique and dear to a person. So if they had a specific item that they took out of Egypt that was special, specific stone or gem, specific tool, or maybe it was the skill set that they didn't actually know that they had, that they actually wanted to contribute, which ultimately allowed them to participate in the actual building of the tabernacle. All kinds of different gifts, all of them voluntary. And so the question sort of lends itself as to why is it that there is such a requirement of this volunteer spirit in the building of the tabernacle. And there's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful article by Rabbi Sachs in Covenant and Conversation called Voluntary Contribution. I happened to see it after I started to prepare, where he goes into the depth as to why it was important that a lot of this be voluntary. And so he says the following: the temple stood at the heart and the center of a nation taken from slavery to liberty. That temple must then embody liberty, and that is built on the voluntary and not the obligatory. Worship forced is not true worship. And he says that God lives not in buildings but in builders, not in monuments of stone, but in the minds and souls of human beings when they dedicate themselves to him. He is to be found not in monumental architecture, but in the willing heart. I mean, who could say it better than Rabbi Sachs? Definitely check out the rest of that article. It's a really beautiful comparison between the way in which the tabernacle is built in the desert and the way in which King Solomon builds the first temple in Jerusalem, and comparing contrasts of the language therein. Very, very powerful, very, very important. So fundamental to the success of the endeavor of building the tabernacle in the desert, of having this sanctuary live and breathe for God in the desert there, required a willing heart. It required the inspired individual to participate. And it could not fully and wholly be compulsory and obligatory. It required the volunteer spirit. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes with you today in Coaching with the Bible talking about volunteerism and volunteering. Because I think a lot of the time we undervalue and underappreciate the amount of volunteering that goes on around us and the significance of it and the importance of it, and that the reality of it is that we are not successful truly unless there's a volunteering spirit around us. It just simply doesn't happen. We've all experienced it to some degree. We never think about it necessarily that way. When people give to us freely and wholly of their own volition for no other reason, they're givers in that sense. It happens all the time. We're not feeling well, we're under the weather. In the context of COVID, all kinds of altruism and volunteering has gone on around the world for all kinds of people in all kinds of places, in all kinds of situations. But we don't think of it necessarily that way. If we're organization-based, if we lead an organization and we think about the contributions that people give, so we think about, as I said at the outset, the financial gifts that people give. Maybe we'll think about a gift of, a real estate, right? Or a person gives clothing or food on some level. But we never think about the gift of time that people give. I remember years ago when I was a rabbi in a small synagogue, I mentioned that a number of times, No surprise that on occasion I didn't agree with my board, or that we just didn't get along, or there were some people on the board that I didn't particularly care for. I imagine there were people on the board who didn't particularly care for me either. I'm sure that's true. But one particular day, I was particularly annoyed. I was speaking to a mentor of mine, and he stopped me for a minute, and he said, I understand why you might be frustrated, annoyed, upset, all kinds of things with your board members, but stop for a moment and try to calculate the time value of their volunteer hours. I may have mentioned this before here in Coaching with the Bible, and if not, I'll mention it here. I have mentioned it to many rabbinic friends and many organizational leaders over time, as I think it's so powerful. Calculate the value of their time in dollars, and then tell me that you're still annoyed with them. When you begin to appreciate that people are giving freely of their time when they have no reason, no need to do so, they simply want to, or there's a beyond that compelling reason to give to a certain organization or communal center, whether it's a synagogue or a church or a mosque or a community center or a food distribution center, whatever it may be, do the math. And if nothing else stops you from saying the thing you might say to them, do the math on it. Because the data tells us that in the United States alone, a couple of years ago, the value of volunteering was estimated at over $184 billion. That's on top of all the money and goods that people are contributing, which those are counted in 990s and annual documents and year-end documents about an organization, but the volunteer hours are not. $184 billion. We couldn't afford to pay for those hours. It's unbelievable. And so we have to begin to appreciate what it is that people are giving when they're giving time. Because the data also tells us that 1 in 4 adults in America give volunteer time. They, on average, they're spending an average of 52 hours a year volunteering. Those are incredible numbers and important. And our organizations and our communities don't necessarily succeed without the volunteers who play that role. The people who are giving of their own volition, who are givers potentially by nature, we're not successful without them. We need them. And so it's important that we start to think about them in that way and start to think about the people who are the givers around us in a way more seriously than perhaps we do at the moment. Do we think about nurturing them? Are we caring for our volunteers? Are we preparing them to succeed? Are we providing them with greater opportunity to continue to do more? Are we overwhelming them? Are they enjoying it? Maybe we should ask them why it is that they're doing what they're doing. And as much as we spend that time around our donors, financial donors, gift givers, we don't necessarily spend that time around our volunteers, and we should. Adam Grant, in his very well-known book, I think it's a bestseller, called Give and Take, talks a lot about what it means to be a giver, what it means to be a taker, what it means to be a matcher. Those are the 3 categories of reciprocity that he describes in the book. And he explains as follows: whereas takers strive to get as much as possible from others, and matchers aim to trade evenly, givers are the rare breed of people who contribute to others without expecting anything in return. We don't know a lot of people like that. We like to believe that we are givers, perhaps. Perhaps for the most part, we are matchers. We're in that space in the middle where we're thinking and balancing what it is that we're trying to do and when it is that we're trying to do it. Hopefully, we're not takers. So if you want to try it on his website, he has a quiz, right? I mentioned last year a couple of times the quizzes that I take to see if how I fare on these different character traits that I'm trying to work on as I develop myself as a human being with Coaching with the Bible, and then privately, unrelated to Coaching with the Bible. So he has one there to figure out how much of a giver you are. And so I was nervous. I took the quiz today, and thank God, 53% giver. So I was more giver than I was taker or matcher, but I'm not as giving perhaps as I'd like to be. So I need to work on my altruism, perhaps on my volunteerism, and how much time I'm giving to others, or perhaps more fundamentally, how I think about the scenarios and situations that are presented and what lens at which I come at them. Do I come at them from the standpoint of the skeptic cynic, which is me a lot of the time? Or can I come at them, or can I develop and work on myself to become more of an altruistic type? To think about these things more from the standpoint of not necessarily getting anything in return. So 53%. But I want us to think about as well the idea that the people around us who are givers, who are volunteers, who are giving their time, deserve better from us, the recipients of their altruism. Because the truth is, everyone can give and everyone can volunteer, but not everyone does. And the famous quote that says, those who can do, I know you're thinking of a different quote, those who can do more, volunteer. The idea here is that people are doing this. People want to do this. People like to do this. And the question is, why? Why do people volunteer? Why do people want to be in these spaces, in these situations? So the truth is, in many cases, because they have a personal connection to the cause. So if it's their child's school, or if it's a local religious center, that they have a personal reason to see the success in that institution. Maybe they, person grew up a certain way and lacked something in their life, or they're the victim of something in their life, unfortunately, and so a cause speaks to them because they benefited from it, or they don't want to see someone else go through it, right? Whatever that case may be, they want to pay it back by paying it forward, that kind of a thing. So people volunteer for a lot of different reasons. Some people volunteer for not the best reasons. They want to build a resume. They want to widen their professional network. They want to build their personal skills, right? Those aren't necessarily the best reasons, but we have an axiom also in our faith that things that don't come about for the right reasons hopefully will ultimately be for the right reasons. But there's a lot of other reasons why people volunteer. They feel like it's important. They feel like it bridges a gap between them and other communities. And so they want to volunteer in spaces where they can grow and learn and deepen their appreciation and their understanding of the wider world. It gives them perspective, awareness around things that they don't suffer from. So there are organizations that, let's say, deal with poverty, that deal with food insecurity. And so if we're in a space where that's not an issue for us, maybe that's where we need to give more of our time. There are many organizations around mental health. So if thankfully we don't suffer from any of these issues, perhaps that is where we then spend our time, because we gain deeper perspective and understanding, maybe deeper appreciation of what it is that we have around us, or what that we have that's good in our own lives, by virtue of the volunteerism and altruism that we share. But the truth is also beyond that, it's actually good for you. Dr. Stephen Post wrote a very famous article some 15 years ago entitled "It's Good to Be Good," that the research around altruistic behavior is that it actually is physically good for you, mentally good for you. It's healthy for you. And so he literally prescribes, that people should volunteer 100 hours a year as a prescription for greater physical and emotional well-being over time. And then there's subsequent research and study on his prescription. His prescription was based on his research. But it seems to be the case. Now, not to overwhelm, not to the point where it's too much, or where it's beyond, where the person who we're trying to help is driving us insane. That's not what we're talking about here. But good general volunteerism. Going to a local club, going to a local food bank, going to a local organization, going to the local synagogue, going to the local church, the local, whatever it is, and providing some time, giving of your time, very, very powerful, and actually very, very healthy. So how do we then do it? How do we encourage it? So Adam Grant, in his book, prescribes a couple things that he really wants people to be mindful of with respect to givers. We want to protect givers from burnout. So because we want more giving to take place in our communities, in our societies, we have to be sure that the people who are givers don't burn out. So we want to encourage the givers. We want to show them the impact of their giving. We also want to appreciate the smaller acts of giving. It doesn't have to be massive. It can be small. It can be every day, a few minutes a day. As he mentioned, something called the 5-minute favor, that a person wants to be altruistic and have as large impact as possible, figure out what the 5-minute favor is for them. Maybe it's introducing two people who they think could benefit from each other. Maybe it's sharing a book with someone over the course of time. Maybe it's just a couple of minutes a day of advice that they're providing to people around them in their work environments. Beyond that, he talks about encouraging people to seek the help. People want to help. It's clearly the case that most people are able to provide a service to volunteer when they know that someone is actually in need. But more often than not, they don't know it, and so they can't offer it. So we need to be able to encourage a space where people are actually seeking help. Maybe it's putting up a help channel on Slack at work where it's really wider. It's not specific to a task, but it's a wider sense of help so that people can actually interact there and provide that service that they want to do that. He talks about a study that was done that nurses sought help on the floors where there was someone whose purpose was to be there to give that help. Meaning that if the person is available and it's given and it's okay, quote unquote, for that person to be there to go and ask them questions, then people actually went and asked them questions. On the places where that person didn't exist, there wasn't that sort of corroboration and collaboration between the group itself. They needed that person to be there. And so we want to be in positions and create the situations where people can succeed. We want to do like Dr. Post says, which is 100 hours a year volunteering. And we can also create that structure internally in our businesses and in our homes by communicating first. This is a strategy I saw on a website called Social Good Connect. That's the three-pronged strategy: communicate, participate, and system. The first thing really is to communicate among the people who you want to now take on some acts of altruism or to build an ethic of volunteerism into your community, into your team. But it has to be a conversation. So communicating the why of this, why it's necessary, why it's important, why you think now, whereas before it wasn't, but now it can be valuable, to get that conversation going, to hear from people who might object, might have a different approach, might have a different theory about how this goes. All that is important in building in the right ethic and the right tone of volunteering in your team. Number two is to participate. Talking about it among your team, but not leading by example, is really of no value. Maybe it's important to find a champion. There's someone on the team, someone in the home, husband, the wife, the spouse, the child, whoever, the oldest sibling, whatever it may be, who's going to lead the charge in this volunteer effort. But give people the opportunity also, not just to talk about it, but to show them where it can work. Show them where it can happen. Incentivize it to some degree. Maybe let people lead on the subject rather than follow on the subject. If your business is in a particular industry, maybe there are industry-related organizations where people can then volunteer their time that are local and then point that out, bring that person into the office to talk about the work that's being done. But also give some people autonomy. Autonomy is one of the great secrets of motivation. Read Daniel Pink's book on motivation. You'll see autonomy is crucial. Giving people the autonomy to figure out where they want to volunteer, how they want to give that time, very, very valuable. But more than anything else, or among everything else, is the system. So to talk about it and to participate in it without creating a system around it is a recipe for disaster. And we've mentioned many, many times before that James Clear talks a lot about in Atomic Habits, but everywhere else, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So fall in love with the system, but put in a system that will work, because without a proper volunteer system in place, people will not, in fact, act. I know I've gone very, very long today, and I appreciate your staying with me. The truth is, this is where we are with volunteering. It's so important. It's so vital. It's so fundamental. It's so crucial to where we are as a society, and we rely on it so much that we need to and have to do more for ourselves and for the people around us who do this, to not only encourage it, but also to sort of incubate it, to sort of also make sure that that it's actually going the right way, that it's encouraged in the right amount, to the right level, to the right degree, so that there is more that then comes of it, so we can benefit more from it. And so, just to end with a quote, because I always like to have a good quote, this is a quote from Martin Luther King. Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to be a college degree. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. And so it is that if we're encouraging the spirit of volunteerism, encouraging people around us and ourselves, and we're looking and pushing ourselves to volunteer more, is to simply have that in mind. It's simply have the heart to serve, the soul that generated by love, and to keep in mind the words that Rabbi Sachs mentioned at the outset today, the notion that it is built not by buildings, but on builders, that it's not in monuments of stone, but in the minds and souls of human beings. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. I thank you for staying with me to the end. Look forward to seeing you next week.